one of our listening devices, the sonobuoys that I talked about a little bit earlier, with the microphone down, and it could be above a layer of different water temperature, and a submarine could be just 80, 90 feet below that, yet you would never hear it. And yet on one occasion, and this was a particularly extreme example, but it's not that unusual, we were sent out to look for a Russian submarine that was apparently reported off the coast of Nova Scotia. And the way that they thought it was a Russian submarine was because everything that puts out noise has a particular signal to it. So if we were able to determine how many cylinders there were in the engine making the noise, how many revolutions the propeller was turning, how many blades there were on the propeller, a whole fingerprint of information about what was producing that underwater noise. So what we were told was that they were detecting on the coast of Nova Scotia what was called a dinky diesel engine, and these were known to be in some of the Russian submarines. And so we were sent out to look for it. And it eventually turned out that what they were actually recording was a dinky diesel, a Russian engine, or a Soviet engine as it was then, but it was in a Russian freighter leaving Liverpool harbor in Britain over 3,000 miles away. And yet here they were picking it up in this layer of temperature and sound under the ocean off the coast of Nova Scotia.
Remarkable.
It's remarkable. But
and important.
And of course, it's hugely important because, of course, if you think about how then, if you got concentrated noise and noise pollution for these creatures that are under the water and very sensitive to sound, how that could be a problem and misdirect them or cause them. It'd be almost like a sort of a water torture if you wanted.
Do you think that's why some whales are beaching themselves?
Well, I've always had that suspicion that certainly you see when they get into shallower waters, which is where the beachings begin. That it could be enough to confuse them sufficiently to beach or to even try and get away from the noise. I mean, it's something that we would do as an animal.
Absolutely.
Is to try and get away from the noise. Now, I have to say there are other possible explanations. For example, and we can talk about this with regard to the oceans as well, but all animals are very sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. And Dr. Brown did a tremendous amount of work on this, on the fact that our brains have magnetite in it, which is one of the most sensitive minerals to magnetism.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. I never knew that.
Well, exactly, and of course the argument is that, and it's now known, by the way, that pigeons, for example, they can navigate even if they don't see the sun, and it's because they're using the Earth's magnetic field. And Dr. Brown even suggested it's one of the reasons that if you're born in a particular area and that magnetic field of that area is imprinted on your brain, if you move away from that, you never really feel comfortable. You never feel you're in your place. And there are parts of the world where there are dead spots or holes of magnetism. For example, there's one off the coast of New Jersey. And they know that when pigeons got into these areas, they were completely confused. And so the whole idea of magnetism and its influence on animals and on their sense of direction. And there are some arguments made that have, I think, some validity, that another part of the problem with them beaching themselves is that they get into areas where the magnetic signal they're getting is throwing off their sense of direction, and that's causing them to beach as well. But I think that basically what we need to say is that regardless of the cause, we need an awful lot of research done on this to track it down. And of course, for me, all of these things simply underline and underscore this arrogant idea that we know so much about the Earth when we know so little. And of course, that's part of why we want to talk about the oceans today, because we know less about the deep oceans particularly than we do about the moon or many of the other planets. And one of the issues with that, by the way, Kim, is that up until about 5 or 6 years ago, the estimates were that there were 20,000 species under the oceans. The figure now has jumped to 20 million. And and of course that fits in with our knowledge that we only have identified and named about 35% of all the species that are on the planet, land species.
The part that you shared with me was fascinating too, which is that Mount Everest is 29,000 feet high, and yet the deepest oceans are 36,000 feet below. That's just mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and as I said to you, the only person that I know of that's ever been down to that Marianas Trench was Dr. Picard in what he called his bath escape, and he was lowered down to that depth. And by the way, at that depth of water, with the water density, if you dropped a 1-pound steel ball, it would take 7 hours to reach the bottom.
Wow.
And so it gives you an idea, and of course you can imagine that the crushing density of the water at that depth, and yet there are creatures living down there, and this is what's so amazing. And of course, another example, we've always argued that you need sunlight to have life, and yet suddenly they discovered these plumes of heat coming out from the underneath the oceans, and we can talk about that as well, where water temperatures of between 400 and 700 degrees Celsius, and yet there was life there that was living off the heat and the sulfur that was being produced. And as far removed from sunlight as you could possibly get on the planet.
What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us, as I said, how arrogant we are about thinking, oh, well, we know everything about the planet and we understand everything. And it just amuses me no end. But of course, the problem is that that arrogance is used to then tell people, oh, well, this is the end of the world and this is happening, and oh, the extinction of species, when we don't even know, almost 60% of them haven't even been found or identified.
I've got to tell you something very serendipitous that happened to have occurred this morning. I saw somebody on Facebook that is affiliated with a nonprofit organization. They do a lot of work with organic farming. So I invited them on to talk about their work with organic farming. I always have a pre-production call with all my guests. Therefore, I take notes, I write the context, plus going to their website and reading their books, etc. But anyway, she starts to talk about how they have this correction having to do with farming to get rid of CO2 and to take care of climate change. And I chuckled and I said, I don't see any of that as a problem. And I'm very interested in your other work. I've done about 300 hours of my own due diligence about this. And climate change is a cycle, and I'm comfortable with it as a cycle. And I've looked at every facet of the wheel of this. And I used to be a zealot like you, and I'm not. And I'm educated now about it, and I'm listening clearly in full context. And she said to me, we don't have the same worldview, and I don't think I can do the show with you. I said, why? She goes, because I don't really know what I'm getting myself into. Obviously, we don't see the same thing. I said, we don't have to see the same thing for you to be a guest on my show. I don't have to agree with you on everything. I mean, that's not a problem. I just wanted you to know where I'm at right now based on the groundwork and the research I've done. And I've really rolled up my sleeves, and I had my blinders on before. So I'm happy to talk about, you want to talk about this, that, the other, whatever. Anyway, she said she doesn't want to be on the show, and that if she did, she'd get back to me. And I find it interesting. And I said, we don't have to agree on everything for you to make a contribution and share about what your organization does. But it's so interesting how a person would take a step back, disassociate, because someone doesn't see exactly what they see. And they would take all the other realms in which they're contributing off the table to share with the public, because God forbid They're talking to somebody that sees something differently in a different context and paradigm than the way they're looking at it.